with nature and what happened during COVID in terms of the human nature nexus. So, the title of my talk today is Using Ecopsychology as a Framework for Explaining Relationships Between People and Nature using COVID-19 as a Case Study. But before I start talking to you about the topic, I just wanted to share with you my nature and research story. So I like to think that my research story started when I was about 6 or 7 years old, and I came across a box of colorful cigarettes in my grandmother's drawer. And I couldn't understand why she never smoked them. They were so pretty. And when I asked her about it, she said that she was keeping them for a special occasion, and I couldn't understand, well, what is a special occasion? When will she smoke them, and what do they represent to her? And somehow I feel like that's where my research interest really started, and my interest in specifically motivational psychology. Then my nature story started with, I like to think, with my mom. And this is her in a newspaper when she was about 18 or 19 years old. And they wrote a story about her because she was rescuing and rehabilitating owls. And from a young age, I really loved animals. So there's Toothless Andrea with two of our dogs when I was growing up. And as an adult, I spend a lot of time in nature. So I love doing hikes. I do multiple day hikes. I do eco psychology workshops with children. I'm also an activist. And I published a paper in PINS about specifically my activism with the endangered western leopard toad in Cape Town. And here is a discussion I had with the mayor of Cape Town, Jordan Hill Lewis, where I really spoke to him very deeply about how to balance the development and the protection of wetlands and endangered species. And then at my most happy place, there I am free diving in the kelp forests. So, the environmental crisis for me is really a crisis of the mind or the psyche. So, what I've seen through my research and reading is that there's really obviously a growing disconnection from humans and nature. So, usually, how I like to explain that is if you had to imagine the history of humanity as walking for 2.5 kilometers through an area, most of this distance is humanity walking through a forest where there's biodiversity, there's coexistence with other species, and there's an interconnectedness. The last couple of meters you can imagine is uncut lawn, so that represents the agricultural age. And the last step is on concrete, which really represents the industrial age that we've gone through. And then, of course, there is the digital age into which our small toe is sticking at the moment. But what I'm really trying to explain here is that we are amputating ourselves from nature when you look at this example. A study showed that the median time spent indoors in South Africa was 19.1 hours per day. And that's tragic because the sound of birds and water can have a profound experience on our healing and a positive effect on our mental state. But when you look at the literature and also my research, it's clear that we are suffering from an extinction of experience. And that's sad because just living, for example, within 100 meters of a tree has been shown to reduce the need for antidepressant drugs. And also, connection to nature has been shown to be a significant predictor of happiness. So, not only are we amputating ourselves from nature, we are reducing our happiness and our mental and physical well being. So, what the environmental crisis really is for me is a deeply failed relationship with nature. But our relationship with nature is actually quite complicated and non-linear. And what I mean by that is it's impacted by so many different variables. It starts from our childhood. Some researchers feel that it even starts within the womb and the environment that we grow in the womb. It's impacted by our values, our social circles, our religion or spiritual beliefs. It's impacted by our family. Even our personality can impact our relationship with nature. And this is really where eco-psychology comes in, because eco-psychology seeks to heal the alienation between the individual and the natural environment for mutual flourishing to occur. Because a relationship that's effectively, so emotionally connected to the biosphere means that what we care for, we protect. And words that have been used to describe this connection, this care for nature, has been biophilia, the ecological self, ecological identity, ecological consciousness, nature relatedness, environmental sensitivity, etc. Many, many words to describe that. But then on the other spectrum of connectedness is also psychoterratic illnesses, which manifest when we are disconnected from nature. So I'll take you briefly through the birth of ecopsychology, but just to say that as a field, it's really been growing a lot over the years. So what is ecopsychology? Ecopsychology combines ecology, which is a branch of biology that deals with the relationships between living organisms and their environment, and it's combined with psychology, which is the study of mind or soul. But more importantly, ecopsychology challenges the dualistic separation of humans and nature, and the fact that some fields believe that humans are the exclusive locus of meaning and value. The field of ecopsychology situates environmental issues in the damaged, affective relationship that individuals have with nature. And that's particularly the part of ecopsychology that I was very interested in when I did my research. So here is a quote from Arne Naes. Every living being is connected intimately, and from this intimacy follows the capacity of identification and, as its natural consequences, practice of non-violence. Now is the time to share with all life on our mistreated earth through the deepening identification with life forms and the greater units, the ecosystems, and Gaia, the fabulous old planet of ours. A lot of people think that the field ecopsychology started with Theodore Roszak in 1992, his book, The Voice of the Earth. But although he popularized the term in that book, ecopsychology has actually been coming quite a long time. Carl Jung spoke about the concern around the repression of nature and animals. Robert Greenway spoke about the term psychoecology, and Anne Naes about deep ecology. And when you look at the principles of eco-psychology and deep ecology, there's a lot of overlap between the two. So eco-psychology has roots in environmental psychology, systems thinking, depth psychology, climate psychology, and it's called many different terms like ecotherapy, green-centered therapy, re-earthing, etc. So eco-psychology really at a fundamental level studies the affective or emotional relationship between human beings and the natural environment. It asks, is eco-psychology modern psychology in search of a soul? And Roszak says, at its deepest level, psychology is the search for sanity, and sanity at its deepest level is the health of the soul. But can a soul or psyche be whole without being interconnected with nature is really the question. So eco-psychology suggests that there's collaboration between planetary and personal well-being. The field acknowledges the historical and cultural significance of humanity's relationship with nature and explores how various societies and, importantly, indigenous cultures have integrated nature into their belief systems, their rituals, and their traditions. Here is a quote from American Indian leader Chief Seattle. What is man without the beasts? If all the beasts were gone, man would die from a great loneliness of spirit. For whatever happens to the beasts also happens to man. All things are connected. Whatever befalls the earth, befalls the sons of the earth. So I chose a couple of concepts that I really like from ecopsychology. And the first really is a very important one, the biophilia hypothesis, which was published in Edward O. Wilson's book called Biophilia in 1984. And at a very basic level, what the biophilia hypothesis says is that there's an innate human tendency to see connections with nature and other forms of life. And I see this when I do research and I ask people, just think about your childhood and what is the first wonderful memory that comes to your mind. Most often than not, people recall something to do with nature or a role that nature plays within that memory is quite significant. Then there's what is called earth emotions. So it's really about the relationship between our minds and the planet. And one of the areas in earth emotions is ecological grief or anxiety, and that manifests as people become more aware of environmental challenges like climate change. Then there is solastalgia, which is feeling of pain and sadness caused by lived negative environmental change. I see that where I live, where people that have lived here for 30 years are feeling a deep sense of solastalgia as we lose our biodiversity and they lose the meaning that they and symbolism that nature represents in their lives. Then there's eco paralysis, which actually speaks for itself. So it's about helplessness, overwhelm, and an inability to make a difference. And then environmental melancholia. Lurtzman wrote about this in her book, and it's really about sadness and experiencing a profound loss and disruption caused by environmental issues. And what is interesting about her approach, excuse me, is that she unpacks, for example, apathy and how for some people apathy is a coping mechanism when they're experiencing this deep sense of sadness for environmental loss. And then on a more positive side, there's eudaimonia, which is a sense of well-being that we get from contact with nature. And research has shown that people that exhibit eudaimonia actually engage in more pro-environmental behaviors. Then lastly, there's ecological consciousness. So humans as part of the larger ecological system and that our actions have direct and indirect impacts on the environment is what is expressed when we have an ecological consciousness. So it really means that there's a greater ecological awareness and that people with this consciousness understands that preserving the environment is good for their health, physical and mental health, but also preserving the environment gives them a deep sense of purpose and connection. So just to talk a little bit about techniques and critiques of the field of ecopsychology. So one popular technique that you've probably heard of is forest bathing. That is really just spending time in preferably a natural forest. It emerged in Japan in the 1980s as a physiological and psychological exercise. And in the 90s, researchers really started studying the impact of spending time in a forest. So I have two ecopsychology colleagues from California that went and tested this all out. And maybe some of you have done this, but typically before you go into the forest, they do a bunch of physiological tests on you. They test your cortisol levels, your heart rate, your blood pressure, etc. You fill in some questionnaires, and then you go in and they compare the results with each other. And typically, obviously, it depends on your baseline before you go in. But typically, looking at a forest for 20 minutes has been shown to lower cortisol in the saliva, your heart rate decreases, blood pressure goes down, your fight or flight system calms, there's an increased immune system functioning, especially after 2-hour walks over 2 days. And after 40 minutes, the body's rest and digest system gets turned on. And research has also shown that forest therapy increases people's ability to problem solve. And for some researchers, they say that this is the chemicals released by the trees that impacts our immune system. I've also read a study where they compared people walking through a forest, some without any technology and some using their phones to have a conversation with someone. And it's quite obvious what the result was there. When you're walking through a forest while on your phone, no benefits for you. But if you walk through the forest mindfully without technology, that's really when you capture the physiological and psychological benefits of walking through a forest. And research has also shown that the more diverse a natural space is, the better it is for you. And I honestly believe that we need to save and protect biodiversity and restore biodiversity for its own sake, but also because it's healthier for us to spend time in biodiverse spaces where we're breathing in all these different diversity of plants and animal breath and all of that. Some other techniques is ecological dream work. It's where you explore dreams that contain elements of nature to understand your relationship with nature. There's wilderness therapy, spending time in wild, biodiverse spaces. Nature immersion, where you try and reduce your stress and you create a sense of connection. Some of this work is also done in normal parks in urban areas. Then there's horticultural therapy, which is really just getting your hands into the soil and plants, and that has a significant impact on your stress levels. There's eco art therapy, which is creating art inspired by nature, ecological self inquiry, which is a reflection process on your relationship with nature, where it started, what it looks like, what role your values, worldviews, concerns play in this particular relationship. And my favorite is cold water immersion, where you connect your body with the body of the water in a mindfulness practice. And there's actually this great book, I don't know if you can see it, called
Fatma, is the presentation done?
No, the presentation's not done. We just have a technical glitch. Please give us just a minute. Um, yeah, Beauty, you know the electricity is off in our town, so just give us a minute, please, Beauty.
Okay, sure.
Thank you so much for that introduction. So today, but before I start talking to you about the topic, I just wanted to share with you Nike. So I chose a couple of concepts that I really like. So ecology. And the first really is then there's some other water. So water. So just briefly, there is some critique against the field of ecopsychology. I've just listed a couple of things here. Um, One of the main critiques is really that not all eco-psychologists are trained as psychologists, and I see that globally as well through the eco-psychology networks. You've got some coaches that come and study eco-psychology and then call themselves eco-psychologists. You get counselors that do that. And then there's also been a critique that there's a lack of scientific objectivity or research in the field. But I have to say that personally, I think that's changing quite quickly. I think there's a lot more research coming out that really shows our emotional relationship with nature, how that really impacts our mental health, and how nature, yeah, also impacts that. Then Reza in 1995 said that there's the assumptions and methods of eco-psychology are too different from accepted psychological standards for it to be considered an area of psychology. So that's quite an old comment, and I think that's also changing. I think the field is really growing empirically, theoretically, practically, and the field has a lot to offer. So now to the juicy stuff, hopefully, which is my research on our emotional relationship with nature in South Africa. So when I started looking at doing this research, this was for my PhD, and later I'll take you through my postdoc research. I did some pilot interviews and I realized, whoa, it's not easy to talk to people about their relationship with nature and to explore it deeply. A lot of people that I at least spoke to during my pilot interviews struggled. They struggled to understand themselves what their relationship was like with nature. So I decided to do a research study to develop a visual technique. Here you can see a picture elicitation technique, and to help people with visuals unpack their relationship with nature. So I published with Professor Andrew Thatcher a paper about this development of this technique in the Journal of Qualitative Methods. So the method I used for my research was mixed methods. It was a 1 hour online questionnaire, after which we did a factor, a cluster, and a discriminant analysis on a sample of 721. And then after the clusters were identified, I then did in-depth interviews using the picture elicitation technique as part of the discussion. And for that, the sample was 44 people, and I used Straussian grounded theory analysis. I recently published a paper about this grounded theory analysis in Sustainability and Climate Change, that particular journal. So my sample for this study was middle and upper income individuals. I had a very good age, gender, ethnicity spread. It was in KZN, Durban, Cape Town, and KZN, Cape Town and Johannesburg was my interviews and most of my sample. And then my quantitative measures was connectedness to nature, which explores our emotional relationship with nature by Meyer in France, the new ecological paradigm by Dunlop, which looked at environmental worldviews, if it's dominant or not. Did the Jung type indicator, which is a personality measure to see if personality plays a role in South Africa to explain our relationships with nature. Then obviously I had to include the Swartz value survey. And then I designed a behavioral questionnaire that included aspects that's relevant to South Africa. So I wanted to understand different behaviors that South Africans engage in. And then I also designed the environmental issues and attitudes questionnaire. And the reason we decided to design that ourselves was also to make it specific for South Africa. So some of the issues that were in there were, for example, canned lion hunting, which, is more prevalent in South Africa, and some other South African issues like rhino poaching. So all of that was in that questionnaire that was designed. Okay, so after all of that, I identified 6 types of relationships with nature. I called them the disconnected type, uncommitted, alarmed, believer, concerned, and the pleasure seeker. And we published a paper, Prof. Thatcher and I, on this in the Journal of Sustainability. I see it's hidden there behind my face, sorry. But if you go on my website, there's links to my publications there. So starting with the disconnected type. So really, this particular type experienced some kind of abandonment in their lives. And to deal with that, they typically disconnected from the outside world. In terms of the Jung type indicator, they were very low on feeling. They tended to use their head rather than their hearts. They avoided other people. A lot of them were struggling financially and in a survivalist kind of mindset, and they tended to feel alone and burdened. So you can see from this picture, it really just shows how isolated this particular type feels from the world. And here's a quote. Um, I was always that part of the puzzle that had to move along. It affected me in such a way that I don't trust anybody now. I don't trust people. I can't. It feels like they are there for a short space of time and then I have to move out. And this was a participant that spoke about not fitting in, being alone, being isolated from the world. And while I was doing the interviews, I really understood how our relationship with nature is impacted by our relationships with other people, our relationship with our history in the world, and the paths that we cross in our lives. All of those different things impact our relationship with nature. So, this particular type was the most disconnected from nature in terms of the quantitative results. They showed apathy towards nature and animals. They were unable to take responsibility for issues related to nature. They tended to believe that technology will solve problems, and they showed a very low level concern for environmental issues. And when it came to climate change, they were disconnected from climate change. They felt it's not in their control, there's nothing that they can do, and they would rather focus on personal achievement and finding personal security. And climate change just didn't fit within that picture for this particular type. The second type is called the uncommitted type. So they tend to look outside at the world from the middle ground. So they seek information. They're quite resilient because they can take different perspectives when they need to. For them, knowledge is very important. They like to contemplate certain issues. They're very conformist. They don't like to stand out, so they're followers, and they tend to seek social approval. So when it comes to their relationship with nature, they behave pro-environmentally in areas that have social value. So to explain that in a simple example is if they live in a street where nobody's recycling, maybe they believe that people should be recycling, but they won't do that. If they're in a street where everybody's recycling, they will recycle as well. That's just a simple example. So their relationship with nature seemed to be quite blurred because of this. They see issues that are pressing, but they tend to lack personal responsibility. So unless there's a lot of people around them doing something, they tend to be a little bit more inactive. So because of that, they were uncommitted about their concerns. They believe that knowledge will preserve nature, and they express a lot of tension between what they see, So climate change is an issue, plastic in the oceans is an issue, what they know from everything they read, but the tension comes from what is society doing and how can they fit into society who's maybe not doing anything about these things. So they're aware of issues that will impact humanity, but they had contrasting ideas about climate change. There was a sense of urgency for them, but low emotional relatedness to the issues because they were paralyzed by ignorance in society and also uncertainty. So these are the types of people in communication campaigns where uncertainty is being spoken about, then you're not activating this particular type with uncertainty messaging. Sorry. Then there's the alarm type. So this particular type, quantitatively, they were the least religious out of all the types. They tended to feel like an outsider. They lacked a need for affiliation. They were highly introverted on the Jung type indicator and oriented towards the inner and subjective world. They struggled to conform. And what was interesting is that a lot of people I interviewed in this particular type had rupturing experiences in their life. And this is a quote from one of the participants that you can't see there, but she spoke about her troubling childhood with her alcoholic father who ended up shooting himself in front of her and her brother. And this had a significant impact later on as well in terms of how she relates to other people and how she related to nature. So for this particular type, they scored low on apathy, so they feel a lot. They sensed and felt and experienced that the world can be a bad place. They expressed a shared victimhood with nature and believed that humans are bad. They tended to connect better with animals and they feel like they expressed the feeling of losing nature. So, in terms of their behavior, they believed in harm reduction behavior. So, they really try to reduce the amount of harm they do to the planet and to animals. And they spoke about witnessing a changing nature. And climate change for them was a potentially rupturing experience. So you can see when you bring in ecopsychology into this particular type framework, these are the kind of people that are likely to struggle with eco anxiety and eco grief, for example. Then there's the believer type. So for this particular type, helping people was very important. They saw themselves as heroes in society. They wanted to build a legacy that strong beliefs. They tended to be religious. They value conformity, tradition, achievement. This all comes from the values questionnaire. They were nurturers and they seek peace. So they spoke about seeing themselves as that person that other people can look up to in their communities. So they tended to have a human-centric worldview. They liked to receive acknowledgement from others. They had a dominant social paradigm in terms of the ecological paradigm scale. And nature for them was something that should benefit humans. And the destruction is part of human progress. And they tended to shift responsibility for environmental issues to government, future generations, and technological progress. So, quantitatively, they were actually not badly connected to nature emotionally, but it just shows you that quantitatively it looks like they're very connected with nature. But when you bring in how they see the world, you can see that they're connected to nature from a human centric point of view, which is very different from other worldviews in the next type that I will describe. So for this particular type, they have very high expectations from nature. They believe that human ingenuity will solve environmental challenges. They connect with nature through humans. And for them, climate change was veiled. They struggled to talk about climate change. They struggled to understand climate change. And yeah, that's basically for them, how their worldview and experiences impacted their relationship with nature. Then there's the concerned type. So this particular type was very open to the world. They feel deeply and intuitively. They tended to be spiritual, independent, curious. They described feeling connected with other people, with nature and animals. They were culturally open, sensitive. They can easily take the perspective of people, of nature, of animals, and they were connected to broader world experiences. And what I mean by that is that this particular type was really open to understanding what's happening more broadly in the world. They weren't switching off because something is not happening in their particular life at that moment. They had an interconnectedness with nature, a real biophilia, which I spoke about earlier. Nature plays an integral role in their lives. They believe that nature should be explored, and they connected with micronature. So when I was doing the interviews, it was quite interesting when they spoke about nature and their relationship. They would also speak about microorganisms, the small insects that we often take for granted. And that was quite special for them to really connect with broader nature or micronature. And in terms of the behavioral questionnaire, they were the ones that behave a bit more pro-environmentally compared to the other types. So for this participant, it is the invisible things, the bacteria that we can't see. I'm very interested in the role they play and what they do for us. Are we not hurting them? Are we not killing them? I'm a bit worried about the beings that we cannot see. So this type is inspired to make a difference in the world. A lot of them were involved in volunteer work. They were concerned about nature and animals, and they believed that crimes against nature was caused by everyone, including themselves. What was interesting about this type is that there was a clear generational consciousness. They spoke about their grandparents' relationship with nature, their parents, and that came down to their relationship with nature. For them, climate change is changing the relationship that they have with nature. So there was also a sense of loss, and they were noticing the loss. And they felt emotionally impacted by climate change. So again, this type is a bit more resilient, but they also tended to talk about feeling down and overwhelmed by what's happening to the planet and animals. The last type is called the pleasure seeker type. Whoa, so this is a very interesting type to research. They tended to focus only on themselves. Quantitatively, they value self-enhancement. They scored the highest on hedonic values and stimulation. They search for pleasure and reward. And interestingly, they were emotionally blunt, and they even said so in the interviews. One participant said, "Sometimes I need a knock on my head because I can't feel anything." So they describe themselves as feeling indifferent to the outside world. They said that they struggled to connect with people and nature. They felt very little for nature. They had low environmental worldviews, and they believed that humans trump nature. So typically, they were not concerned about environmental issues. They scored the lowest on behaving pro-environmentally. They were apathetic about climate change, and climate change, they started reframing it as maybe it has financial benefits. If there's a collapse and the banks have to close, maybe then I won't have debt anymore. And that's sort of the narratives that they used for themselves to make sense of climate change. But before the interview, they did admit that they never really talk about climate change. They never really think about climate change. It's just not something within their worldview framework. Okay, COVID-19. So this is my postdoc research, and I tried to take it longitudinally taking my PhD research and then placing it within the COVID time period and seeing what does this tell us about the relationship that people have with nature in the middle of a pandemic. So I went into this research with a hypothesis, and this came out in the beginning of the pandemic, where a lot of theorists were saying the pandemic acted as an existential disruptor and it will increase connectedness to and concern about the natural environment and animals and climate change. And I was really curious about that. Did COVID really do that for South Africans? And for my study, I used terror management theory as a theoretical framework because the pandemic was a mortality salience induction event. So for this study, follow-up study, if I can call it that, it was a 30 minutes online questionnaire. We did factor analysis again, we did correlation analysis, regression analysis, and structural equation modeling, where we started to model what everything looked like during COVID, what impacts, what variables, what direction are they in, and the results are actually quite interesting. But I'm not going to take you through all of that today. But we are publishing a paper about the structural equation modeling soon. So for this study, we had a sample of 655. We post-weighted the sample to match the 2016 sample so we can compare the two data sets with each other. We included again the environmental issues and attitudes questionnaire, the connectedness to nature, the new ecological paradigm scale, but then we also wanted to include climate change risk perception. So we included van der Linde's model in our questionnaire because we really wanted to understand, did COVID impact the way people perceive climate change risk? Are people aware that maybe climate change, could have such a big impact like COVID? Maybe climate change is happening more than they thought. And then to bring in terror management theory, we designed a COVID-19 and climate change questionnaire where we brought in terror management theory statements, we brought in connection to nature statements, and we brought in some apathetic questions as well. And we did a beautiful factor analysis on that where 3 different factors came out. But if you want to know more about that, you have to read our paper on the structural equation modeling because we unpack all of that in that paper. Okay, so at a very basic level, what happened during COVID for these different types of people? So remember the disconnected. So for them, very interesting for me, there was a statistically significant increase in their connection to nature during COVID. And I have to say, sorry, just quickly, that the fieldwork was done in 2021. And at that time when we did the fieldwork, it was lockdown level 3. So just to give you an idea of where we were at, but they had obviously already gone through 2020 with all the different lockdowns, etc. But although this type had a significant increase in their connection to nature, out of all 6 types, they were still the lowest connected to nature. With COVID and climate change, overall, they felt the strongest about not worrying about public issues or climate change. They just cannot focus on future issues because they said quantitatively that they see their lives as fragile. So this is interesting because it means you can already see that the pattern hasn't changed for this type. They still can't deal with the outside stuff. They are still survivalist. They're still worried. They're still quite alienated from the world. And they just have to focus on themselves because as they grew up, they had abandoning experiences. Even in the adulthood, some people had abandoning experience. And during COVID, it reinforced that idea that life is fragile for this particular type. So for the uncommitted type during the pandemic, They were significantly more concerned about the exploitation of animals, which makes sense because, as I said, this particular type liked knowledge, they liked reading. So, obviously, during the pandemic, there was a lot of information out there about the zoonotic nature of the pandemic, and they obviously read that. For them as well, what the pandemic did, and it's not actually surprising when you think about it, it increased their awareness of the fragility of their own lives. For the alarmed type, they were still highly concerned about domestic animal welfare, but now they felt significantly less able to make a difference during the pandemic. So they started experiencing that kind of paralysis that I spoke about earlier. And for them as well, there was a fragility of their own life that the pandemic brought into focus for them. For the believers, so if you can remember, they were the heroes, they are the heroes. There was a significant increase in shifting responsibility and belief that technology will solve issues. So they were already believing that before the pandemic, but what happened, the pandemic made them believe this even more. The link for them between COVID, there was a link for them between COVID-19 and the way nature is treated. And interestingly, they said that they changed their consumption behavior during COVID, and they had the highest score on that their lives are fragile. So I don't unpack this here, but this fragility of life really ties into terror management theory. And I would highly suggest reading the theory if you're not aware of it. It's fascinating what happens to our mind, the way we relate to nature when our awareness of our own death comes into focus because we suppress the awareness of our mortality. And when there's a triggering event like COVID and it comes to our consciousness, it changes things for us. Not changing in a good way necessarily, but it reinforces the expression of our worldviews and our biases. And I can see that in the results from our study. Then for the concern type, what COVID did for them, they were more worried about climate change. And there was an increase in a sense of control over natural disasters. So they believed that technology will solve issues. And they had the highest score on that their lives are fragile.
Hi everybody. Just give me a minute to share with you the presentation. We were on slide 59. Right. She sound presentation mode. Right.
For the believers, so if you can remember, they were the heroes, they are the heroes. There was a significant increase in shifting responsibility and belief that technology will solve issues. So they were already believing that before the pandemic, but what happened, the pandemic made them believe this even more. The link for them between COVID, there was a link for them between COVID-19 and the way nature is treated. And interestingly, they said that they changed their consumption behavior during COVID, and they had the highest score on that their lives are fragile. So I don't unpack this here, but this fragility of life really ties into terror management theory. And I would highly suggest reading the theory if you're not aware of it. It's fascinating what happens to our mind, the way we relate to nature when our awareness of our own death comes into focus because we suppress the awareness of our mortality. And when there's a triggering event like COVID and it comes to our consciousness, it changes things for us. Not changing in a good way necessarily, but it reinforces the expression of our worldviews and our biases. And I can see that in the results from our study. Then for the concern type, what COVID did for them, they were more worried about climate change. And there was an increase in a sense of control over natural disasters. So that was quite interesting. They felt like they had more of an ability to control natural disasters, and I'm still trying to make sense of that. But what I think is that they felt that we could respond, globally respond to COVID in certain ways, which means that actually we have the ability to respond to big natural disasters as well. They believe that humans are having a negative impact on the natural environment. COVID reinforced that, and they scored lower on changing their consumption behavior. But remember, initially they were the more conscious type, and they were already behaving more pro-environmentally. So there wasn't much of a change for them in terms of that. Then for our pleasure seeker, they were significantly less concerned about many environmental issues. I didn't think they could be any less concerned than they already were, but yes, they were even more concerned about environmental issues during COVID. They were the least likely to believe that there is a link between COVID and the destruction of nature, and they scored the lowest on COVID and climate change factors. So they just really, in the initial study, they were the ones that also scored the lowest. And yet again, what COVID did for them is it made them even less connected to nature emotionally. Okay, so what are my conclusions? So there's many conclusions from all of this, and I'm sorry if I overwhelmed anyone. But basically, what the pandemic did was it made many types feel fragile and not in control of their own lives. Terror management theory. And a system then aims to self-preserve. The pandemic did not significantly alter effective relationships with the biosphere. It just reinforced existing ways of being and feeling in the world. And this expands our understanding of terror management theory, because this is what terror management theory says, but it hasn't ever really looked at our relationship with nature during a pandemic and a mortality salience event. So, unfortunately, from the results, it seems like the pandemic was not necessarily an awakening to a planetary crisis for all people, because the shifts were reinforced by the type story or the type worldview or the type narratives that they already had. So, it suggests that a disaster cannot meaningfully shift our emotional relationship with nature. And that's really where the question mark for me is, because if the study shows that a disaster cannot meaningfully shift our emotional relationship with nature, what will? How do we get people that don't care about nature to start caring about nature? And my one answer is that it needs to start in childhood, but that's an obvious answer. But maybe we can talk a little bit more about that during the question and answer session. So thank you so much for your time. I am Dr. Andrea Marie Potgieter. I identify as a conservation psychologist. That's my website where you can go and see some of my publications. I also have a reading list of eco-psychology books that I would recommend. For example, I have some here, Ecotherapy. One of my favorite books is Think Like a Mountain. And this book really talks about the Council of All Beings, which is a fantastic eco-psychology exercise. Another ecotherapy book. And then there's quite a lot of eco-psychology books, but they're all listed on my website. The Radical Eco-Psychology is an interesting one. So you can just go on there and have a look. And if you have any questions after today, you're welcome to email me, andrea@conservationpsychology.co.za. Thank you so much for your time.
Right. Thank you so much for that lovely presentation, Dr. Andrea. And thank you everybody for staying on a few minutes longer. If there's anybody that would like to ask any questions, you can either raise your hand or you can put your question in the chat box. Right. So we have one comment by Sharon. Sharon voice suggests the integration of animals into therapy. We don't have any other comments at the moment. Am I audible, Andrea? Can you hear me?
I can hear you, Fatima. Can you hear me?
Yes, quite clearly.
Oh, great. Okay, good.
Okay, lovely.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, there is quite a lot of animals. Obviously, there's animal-assisted therapy that's being used. I just think, one needs to look at the ethics obviously involved in that. I do know of an ecopsychologist that works with kids and dolphins. I'm not sure, what ethical clearance she received in terms of that, but I also know of therapists working with therapy dogs, which definitely has a role to play. I just think we always need to check our ethics, when we integrate other beings into our therapeutic mechanisms. But
No,
thank you
that's
for that, Sharon. Great comments. Yeah.
yeah, that's a very valid point because we don't want to end up working with animals and integrating them into the counseling process and then have more harm come to them or distress them in any particular way. So yeah,
Absolutely.
Beauty, you can go ahead and ask a question.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for such a lovely presentation. I loved it. It came at the right time at my university because these days is more concerned, the university is more concerned with biodiversity, the biosphere reserve. The University of Venda is actually situated in a very large biosphere reserve, the Vembe one. So, but currently now, we are going to have something called Makadu Musina Economic Zone, where, we are going to have things like coal mining into this beautiful environment. So I don't know, what do you think the impact that we can have into, educating, I don't know, whoever it is that is going to be leading this, because I know, the economic zone is going to bring a lot of jobs and stuff like that. Like on your presentation, you indicated that there are those that, worry about money. What can I get out of this? But the environment is going to be affected highly by this Musina Makado economic zone. And I don't know, what difference can we make as conservative or eco-psychologists or environmental psychologists, because we know that the environment is very important in to our psychology.
Sure. Sure. Thank you for that, Beauty. It's quite alarming. It's happening everywhere. I'm also involved in a nature reserve in Piketberg where they're struggling with the same thing, where there's a mining application in a protected area. So I completely understand the alarm around that. So from my activism work, the recommendation I would make is to make sure to be involved from the beginning of the public participation process, and to get communities involved to show the value that the natural environment is actually giving them, the traditional connections, the generational connections, and the ecosystem services that a lot of these biodiversity spaces give people. And I found that with the mining application that we're dealing with, they also promise jobs, but the payoff really, when you take such an economic argument to something like a mine, is that they never really balance that with, okay, you're creating a certain amount of jobs, but what are communities losing as well in that process? Water pollution, air pollution, noise pollution. I don't know what kind of mine it is, but I would really suggest just getting involved from the beginning in the public participation process. I know that Dr. Barnwell has written a paper about the impact of mining on communities, and perhaps using that during the public participation process as well. And maybe getting environmental lawyers involved as well, who understand the legal frameworks that are supposed to protect biodiversity. I mean, that South Africa has agreed to the 30 by 30, that we're supposed to protect 30% of oceans and land. But how do we do that if we're encroaching on these biodiverse spaces? So I don't know if that answers you, Beauty, but I would just get involved, get people, get communities involved, get communities to meet, and make your voices heard. And good luck.
Right. So thank you so much for that question, Beauty. I still don't have any questions in the chat box, but we are 13 minutes over the time that we had. And I just wanted to say thank you, Andrea, for staying on during the webinar with all the glitches with the electricity in my town. This is the second day that the substation has blown. So, yeah, that's a reality of us as South Africans and that we have to deal with. So, I really want to say thank you so much for the lovely presentation. You demonstrated quite clearly the relationship between humans and nature and the various ways in which we engage nature. And I look forward to seeing how we do more work around the ecopsychology spaces. Right. So, from the Climate and Environmental Psychology Special Interest Group, we just would like to say thank you to you for the amazing presentation and the time that you spent to really encourage us to think more broadly about what it is that we are doing. Mia Pinar has a comment. She says, such an interesting and compelling, reassuring content. Thank you so much. Yeah, so we have one comment. Right, so
Thank you, Fatima. Fatima, I also just want to say thank you so much for everything you do in the background and, problem solving, and for everyone that was so patient to stay online. Thank you for that. And also just to say, if anybody has any other questions, they're more than welcome to email me. Beauty as well. If you want to ask and communicate more, I'm very open to chatting about anything. And yeah, I'm here through email and yeah, just let me know. But thank
Thank
you,
you so
Fatima. Thanks for the
much. Thank
opportunity.
you.
right.
Thanks.
So thank you everybody for being here today and participating in this webinar. We look forward to seeing what other webinars we can present in the future. So thank you, Dr. Andrea, and the participants in this webinar. Have a wonderful day further. With that,
Thank you.
we're concluding.
Bye bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.